Well, good afternoon. The second ECOSOC Forum on Financing for Development will wrap up this afternoon, and there's some interesting news that's emerging from the forum. And with us here today is His Excellency Frederick Makamure Shava, and the co-chairs of the forum are Ambassador Marc Pecsteen de Buytswerve of Belgium and Ambassador Jerry Matthews Matjila of South Africa. I'd like to start with Mr. Shava.
Thank you very much. This really is an occasion just to highlight what's happening with the Finance for Development Forum. And historically, you will recall that in July 2015, heads of states met in Addis Ababa and agreed on what we now call the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which included a financing framework, which we have since called Finance for Development, and in short, FFD. And the first meeting for Finance for Development was in July 2016, and we are now doing the second meeting of Finance for Development. The Finance for Development aspect is characterized by the usual economic, social, and environmental and humanitarian constraints. And as people meet, they look at these constraints and ask how far the SDGs are being implemented in that context. The levels of implementation of the SDGs are, as you know, at the various stages, at the various, they're implemented at the national levels, various levels, national, regional, and the multilateral. And in the FFD, efforts are being made to discover exactly what happens at each level, domestic resource mobilization at the national level. What is it? How is it doing? The ODA at the multilateral level, how is it doing? And people are discussing all those aspects. The FFD forum also has stakeholders who are involved in the meeting, and they are sharing lessons and successes. And we also do have Bretton Woods institutions in the meeting. And today actually is the two ministerial segments, which include the Bretton Woods institutions, World Trade Organizations, and UNCTAD. And they will be interacting on various issues of how to implement the SDGs. Then tomorrow there will be tomorrow and the next day there will be the expert segment, which will feature dialogue with stakeholders. Stakeholders will include the private sector as well as civil society. And I think I just want to emphasize that the FFD is not just a policy space occasion, but it also does intend to bring about concrete action. But with these introductory words, I want to introduce the two co-facilitators who have negotiated a common position, an agreed position by member states. Marc Pecsteen, the ambassador of Belgium, and Jerry Matjila, the ambassador of South Africa. They've been meeting with the member states in order to reach an agreement, some consensus on the way forward and they will go into the detail. All I can say is that I'm particularly pleased that this time round we have an agreed position before, which was reached before the meeting began, and it will be adopted today. And it has been translated into all the languages, I'm informed. So over to you, gentlemen. Who starts?
Marc. I will. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to present indeed the result of our collective work. So the outcome document, which is called the inter-governmentally agreed conclusions and recommendations of this second forum. We believe we have arrived at a document that is substantive, balanced and comprehensive, yet remains relatively concise. It assesses progress, identifies implementation gaps when they are, and also recommends actions and measures, concrete measures on a range of issues in order to ensure the full implementation of the Addis agenda in support of the SDGs. Of course, that remains the main goal. So the outcome document acknowledges the significant impacts of the challenging global environment, economic environment, on the implementation of the Addis agenda, including difficult macroeconomic conditions, as well as humanitarian and humanitarian crisis and conflicts. It recognizes fundamentally that the current global trajectory will not deliver the goal of eradicating poverty in all its forms by 2030. So in order to reverse that trend, countries agreed to accelerate, to redouble their national and international efforts to implement the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. So the outcome document presents, a few corrective actions in all 7 actions areas of the Addis Agenda, as well as a range of cross-cutting issues, including gender equality, infrastructure investment, and social protection. Throughout the documents, member states also note the importance of paying attention to the needs of countries in special situations. So we are not going to make a full presentation of this document here, but we will just highlight some of the key policy commitments, in particular those that build on and go beyond agreed policies contained already in the Addis agenda. So, for instance, the document includes ambitious new language on gender equality by emphasizing that GDP could increase significantly if every country achieved gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Countries commit to transformative actions on gender and highlight the need to better consider the impact of development finance on gender equality. Also, the document places great emphasis and special focus on investment in quality, reliable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure. So the focus is on infrastructure, with special attention given to transit and transport, including a request to the Global Infrastructure Forum to give consideration to this issue in its next annual meeting. In this connection, countries agree that increased long-term oriented investments need to be complemented by measures to assist the poor and vulnerable people. They also commit to expand peer learning among countries on financing social protection systems. The document also acknowledges strengthened awareness of the link between taxation, expenditure, good governance, accountability, and anti-corruption efforts. It firmly commits countries to continue strengthening international cooperation in tax matters, supporting greater international efforts to curb illicit financial flows, and making the recovery of stolen assets a priority. To fully tap private finance at the national and international levels, countries pledge to increase the volume and quality of domestic and foreign investment and to pursue policies that better align these flows with sustainable development.
On international development cooperation, ODA, the outcome document notes with concern a decrease in ODA to LDCs and call on ODA providers to fulfill their respective commitment and to set a target to provide at least 0.2% of ODA to LDCs. Countries also highlighted the potential of catalyzing additional finance from the source, public and private, and through appropriate design risk-sharing instruments, including co-investment, public-private partnership, and guarantees. The document also reaffirms that international trade is an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction and can contribute to promotion of sustainable development. On debt and debt sustainability, countries welcome progress on debt management, in particular on sovereign debt management, debt crisis prevention, and on market-based solutions for sovereign debt restructuring. The document recognizes the systemic challenges in implementing Addis Ababa agenda. It also reaffirms that the 2008 World Financial and Economic Crisis underscored the need for sound regulation of financial markets to strengthen financial and economic stability, as well as imperative of global financial safety net. On science and technology and capacity building, the outcome document notes progress that has been made in facilitating access to many technologies, but express concern about the significant digital divide across and within countries. The document in the monitoring and follow-up reaffirms the importance of high-quality disaggregated data for evidence-based policy making and for monitoring progress of implementation of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Addis Agenda. Countries also appreciated the report of interagency task force. As you know, there was an interagency task force that examined a number of thematic areas and says that, and we asked them to work on so they can then report back to us in 2018. Member States also agreed that the third Economic and Social Forum for Finance for Development follow-up will take place from 23rd to 26th of April 2018. This time around, we set the date now on 2018. So these were the kind of the outcomes based on very constructive and cooperative discussion and dialogues among the 193 member states of the UN. Mr. President, I think we gave a summary of the outcomes. So maybe we can invite President any questions from.
Thank you. And are there any questions? Yes.
Thanks very much. Ambassadors, Mr. President, on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, thanks for doing this briefing, and it's always great to have ambassadors come and speak to the journalists. In terms of domestic resource mobilization, Ambassador Shava, could you just speak, maybe use Zimbabwe as an example and the challenges that a country like Zimbabwe would face in terms of their domestic resource mobilization for financing for development? And then more broadly, former South African President Thabo Mbeki's high-level panel on illicit financial flows, some $50 billion annually leaving the African continent, money that could be used for the achievement of the SDGs. You didn't mention anything about that. Can you speak specifically to what is being done or the progress that has been made in trying to recover those monies so that it can go back into development? Thank you.
The second aspect of your question will be answered by the co-facilitators. The first aspect of your question, it is quite clear to most member states that the first effort for implementing the SDGs must be done by the country itself through domestic resource mobilization. This could be through various formulas, either good tax collection, through private sector partnerships, through the 3 Ps, private public partnerships, and several other aspects that can generate funds at a domestic level. You mentioned Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a very interesting example which has tried to use domestic resource mobilization in light of the sanctions imposed on it after the land reform. And we have not fallen behind in trying to implement the SDGs. In fact, we have collapsed the 17 SDGs into 4 clusters, which we call ZIM assets. And these 4 clusters are related in terms of their function. And in those 4 clusters, we try to ensure that the public sector has a role, private sector has a role, and partnerships have a role. And we, of course, do get assistance through UN-based entities that operate in Zimbabwe.
I understand the President has to close this morning's session, but if the co-chairs can continue.
On the question asked on the...
So can I go? Please.
On the illicit financial flow, indeed, the member states discussed this issue at great length. You know, there is something called see, track, see it, get it, and return. You know, you track, you see it, you get it, and you return. In the document, the member states call for, I think, broaden international cooperation to deter, detect, you prevent, and we make the return of this money a priority. We did note the work of the high-level panel from Africa. It is there in the document. But it's a very, very important part of addressing the issue of local resource mobilization. And we also linked up this thing with the work of other agencies in the area of work. But certainly it was something very, very important to the member states that until and unless we do this, we may deny countries the necessary resources to implement the SDGs. Because in some situations, like in Africa, it's more than 50 billion. Some countries, even a third of their, like Ecuador, even a third of their GDP is lost through siphoning. So it's a very serious issue that member states discuss. But also we thought that we have to build capacity for countries to deal with this issue. and to also ensure automatic information exchange, so that you see this thing coming, you tell the other partner about it. Right? Okay.
Other questions? Matthew.
Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks to the two of you for staying. And I wanted to ask about debt sustainability and sovereign debt resolution, orderly workouts. I know that there was a GA resolution passed on this issue. I'm curious what steps have been taken to implement it. And I think that the EU abstained, the EU countries abstained from that resolution. So I wanted to know, not to have you go at it, but is there a difference, do there continue to be difference of views among the membership of ECOSOC on how the rights of countries to have a resolution that's not just market-based, but that's sort of sovereignty-based? And if so, how does this document address them, and what do you think is the future of this issue going forward? Thanks.
Well, first of all, I'm not personally an expert on this issue, but of course, yes, there is a paragraph on debt and debt sustainability, and that was, of course, also discussed very much during the negotiations. And indeed, as you say, of course, there are differences of views on this, and so how far should we go? Certainly, there is no common view so far on the details. But what we agreed is that we have to work together and to approach this problem. And there are several references to existing work which is being done on that sustainability, including the IMF, the Paris Club, the G20. So all these initiatives are recognized, are mentioned, and we recognize the need, to assist developing countries to also, better manage their debt, that's basically it. So we don't go into details here, of course, but the idea to continue working on this issue is very, very much there.
Just a very fast follow-up. Maybe my understanding was that the proponents of the GA resolution, Argentina, Bolivia, others, they don't think that the IMF approach is the right approach, and they probably don't. I can't speak for them, but there seemed to be they were pushing for a UN-based approach as opposed to putting the language into contracts. So I'm just wondering, has anything moved on that? When you say that it's embracing the three approaches that you mentioned, all seem to be that seemed to, at least I heard them being criticized in the General Assembly during the passage of the resolution last time. Is it still? I guess is the balance, is the needle tipping toward the IMF G20 side of it, or is this any movement toward actually implementing what seemed to be in the resolution?
Yeah, well, I think at this stage there is no agreement to have this work in the UN. I think that is clear. So whether it goes in one direction more than in the other, I cannot say. But yes, that is the situation right now. Jerry, would you like to add something?
I think that's a very important question. And I agree with Marc. You see, this is where the UN needs more and more continuous dialogue so that we can reach some understanding. Argentina was a point in can. You know what happened in Argentina. And all of us, we knew that the debt thing, went up into 2015, went to its height, and said, this is not sustainable. So something ought to be done when we have that record high level of debt. So we then thought, let's look at the composition of debt. How is this between private, corporate, institutional? How is this? And then see where governments can make some input. And you recall the case of Argentina and how this was dealt with. I think it brought to bear a number of issues that we need to deal with. So I think in the discussions, without going too much into the details, we look into how we manage it based on those categories and various levels of debt, from corporate to institutional to a private-owned debt. And then we also then agreed that something ought to be done, especially if you look at the debt in the LDCs, LLDCs, in the seats. If you don't do anything about it, you may not assist them to move forward. So I think there is a very conscious decision. And we hope that when you ask them, the ITF to prepare for next year, it's an area of work that we can really deal with an idea to find something acceptable. Because you have to pay debt anyway. You have to pay it. Because you borrow, you have to pay debt. So you must find a middle path between the debtors and those who own it, and how do we do? Because at least we need one another so that we can move together in a more cooperative way. I think the idea here was more and more to sort of look at the Paris Club. What is the Paris Club doing? What is happening in the G20 in all those areas to make sure that we can have a coordinated cooperative UN system so that we can address the challenges of all UN member states in the spirit of the SDGs, and to make sure that we eradicate. Because the corner of this thing is to help us to eradicate poverty and to address the issue of environment and social inclusion. So that is one of those that needs to be managed carefully so that we can then achieve that objective by 2030.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm Amy Lieberman with DevEx. I wanted to ask about innovative finance and how discussion of this factored into your talks over the last few days, and also now what the next steps are actually for you moving forward to make sure that some of these pledges are implemented, what the follow-up will be. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there is reference in the document about innovative finance mechanism. Again, without great detail, because again, this is a very general document, and we wanted it to keep concise, so we cannot go on each and every issue into details. But certainly the idea is there, and we encourage new development, new innovative ideas in this field. That is clear. No, your question on the next steps. Well, this forum is an annual forum, so there will be a new one in April next year, and that will be, of course, the occasion to come back on all these issues and see what progress has been made, will be made at that time on all the commitments which have been here reaffirmed in this document. So in the meantime, of course, well, it's up to each and every country to work on these, and also some international organizations, of course, are mentioned also. They also have work to be done, that's where we will see in 1 year where we are, and there will be the IATF report, the Interagency Task Force report. There will be a new one, which will certainly go into the different issues here. And in some part of the text, we have actually tasked very specifically the IATF to report on certain issues, so that in order to inform better the discussion next year.
Just briefly, in the current environment, until we tap other sources of finance, we'll not realize the SDGs. We are told that we need $7 to $8 trillion annually towards SDGs. In other words, we need about $90 trillion by 2030. Now, government doesn't have those sources. So there's an idea now that we have to go into the private sector, over and above local, national, regional, international development finance institutions. You have to go to the private sector to tap those resources. And you go to philanthropic organizations, you go to other entities that have those funds. So you have to create an environment for them to come in. The second way is, look, we have an ODA. Why don't you use it as a catalyst and crowd in other investment from other sources? Because you have an ODA, use it carefully and attract other sources for especially financing infrastructure for long term. Education, health, water and others. But you need infrastructure to do that, because if you have an infrastructure development, then you are. The third area was, as you do this thing, bring along women and girls, to bring that gap. We say we are losing if we have this inclusive economic growth and women play a role. The possibility of bringing 12 trillion into the economy by 2030. So when we restructure, when we design the program and projects for the future, we have to make sure that women participate. And so also to bring the SMEs into global value chains. If we do all these things and we realign and streamline our financing with a better possibility to realize the SDGs. So innovative financing and other such measures are very important if you look into consideration with other efforts that have been made, as Marc was saying, so that by when we review next year the ATF report, after they map all these kind of financial envelopes, social finance, how they are used, budget, then I think we have a better view of how do we take the next robust step towards implementation of the Addis Ababa agenda.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, in that case, thank you very much for coming.